Hello there, everyone. Welcome to CGTN live streaming. We are coming to you live from Beijing. This is our special live forum, One Planet. I'm Zhong Shi, and today, April 22nd, marks World Earth Day. Climate change, habitat destruction, pollution. These are all real threats facing our environment and indeed everyone on our planet. During today's forum, we're going to discuss all of these environmental challenges and demonstrate our support towards a greener future. And today, I am so happy to be joined by a fantastic group of experts. They are Kaveh Zahedi, Deputy Executive Secretary of the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, and Guido Broekhoven, the Head of Policy, Research and Development at the WWF International. Wang Bingbing, Assistant President of the Institute of Climate Change and Sustainable Development at Tsinghua University, and Rodney Ndemba, the Chief Executive of the Institute for Sustainability Africa. Thank you so much for joining me today. Now let's dive in right with our first topic today. Let's talk about biodiversity and conservation. Scientists say we're currently undergoing a sixth mass extinction. These are big words. These are scary words that paint a very scary scenario, but could that be real? Let's talk about this with our guests, beginning with Mr. Broekhoven. Every 2 years, the WWF publishes the Living Planet Report. That's a science analysis on the world's wildlife populations. According to the latest report, there's been an average drop of 68% in the population sizes of vertebrate species since 1970. And coincidentally, that was when the first World Day was held and celebrated. Sir, let me start with you. Just how serious is this problem of species extinction?
Yeah, thank you for having me on the program and for that question. The situation is indeed very serious. We are, as you are saying, currently at the brink of the sixth mass extinction, and 1 million species are at risk of extinction in the next decades. That's one of 8 out of 8 known species. Now, the implications of that are profound, both for nature itself, of course, but also for people. Biodiversity is incredibly relevant for our economy, for our agriculture, and for our well-being indeed. So if we continue at this path of business as usual, then the implications for people will continue to get worsen. So it is indeed a very serious situation that needs urgent attention.
Can I ask you just about that issue? You mentioned the implication for people so that people can relate to this problem in a better sense.
Yes, well, just to give you a few examples, agricultural production depends on pollination. Pollination is done by insects. In many places around the world, insect populations are dropping very fast. So that means that there's less pollination, and that impacts agricultural production. Also, a lot of our medicines still depend on biodiversity, on products from nature, from plants, etc., to produce new medicines. But of course, in many parts of the world, also people depend directly on products from nature. So there's also the direct impact on the people that live in and around natural areas.
Understood. Thank you so much. Mr. Ndemba, you work with sustainability. Sustainability is a big part of your job on an everyday basis. What do you think has been the principal cause of all of this biodiversity loss?
Thank you so much. So from my perspective and in the work that we do working around corporate sustainability, one of the key things that we have got to understand is that human presence on Earth and the biodiversity are interlinked. Therefore, the activities should actually be balanced on both ends, because humans and biodiversity depend on one another. The conservation of biodiversity is a human responsibility. and also the survival of human beings on this planet all depends also on biodiversity. But what we have tended to see is that businesses and human activities have continued to increase, where we are now seeing uncontrolled agricultural activities, use of chemicals that have got impact on biodiversity, poor waste management, unplanned human settlements, and also the increased harvesting of timber, and also pollution at a large scale in the name of economic development. And these all impacting on biodiversity. Yet the core is now for sustainable practices through corporate sustainability.
You know, part of the reason why we're having this forum today is to have people hear both the problems and possible solutions. And for that, I do want to turn to Dr. Wan here. Dr. Wan, at the UN Biodiversity Conference in Kunming in 2021, Chinese President Xi Jinping announced the establishment of 5 national parks. Are national parks a common way to protect and conserve biodiversity? What is the expected benefit from those national parks?
Thank you for having me in this program, and especially in this special day, the Earth Day. As you said, China has officially established the first bunch of national parks, including Sanjiangyuan, Gender Panda, Emerald Tiger and Leopard, and Hainan tropical rainforest and the Wuyi Mountain, with a protection area of 230,000 square kilometers and covering nearly 30% of the land-based wildlife species under state K protection. Yes, it's a common approach to protect the nature. And in China, the construction of an ecological civilization system is a national strategy, and the national parks are the main elements of it. So accordingly, China is bringing the important natural ecosystems, natural landscape, heritage, and the most abundant biodiversity into the national park system. It can better maintain the integrity of the natural ecosystem and leave the precious natural assets for future generations.
Everyone, one word we're going to hear a lot today is cost. And that's something we cannot circumvent because this isn't a new issue. We've had some pretty good ideas. We know generally what we're supposed to do, but the cost will always be an issue there. Who should be financing all of these ideas we have? How do we go forward? How do we incentivize people, businesses, and the government to put in more of an effort? I want to now turn to Mr. Zahedi. You know, despite broad recognition that reserves do a great job in protecting biodiversity and rare species, the costs can be high. What is your take on this trade-off?
Well, I'm not sure it is a trade-off because in a way the cost-benefit argument for biodiversity protection can be a little bit misleading because while many of the costs seem to be quite clear, the benefits of ecosystem services from climate regulation to fisheries to tourism are often invisible or maybe unaccounted for. Like investing in protecting mangroves or coral reefs, of course it brings benefits for local fishing communities, for the fishing industry. It helps with local disaster risk reduction in terms of coastal protection. But these kinds of benefits are rarely captured in the equation. And sometimes, or most of the times, the benefits go way beyond the protected areas. I remember a figure that really stuck in my head was when a study was done on the coral triangle in the Western Pacific Ocean, which is one of the most biodiverse and ecologically important coral reefs in the world. And the study showed that this region, properly protected, can bring about an economic return of over $16 billion a year from tourism, from fisheries, and from sustainable coastal development. So I think we have to have a balanced approach to that cost-benefit analysis.
But then would you recommend for better calculations, to better equations really, so people understand that this money that they're putting in can be used towards generating economic benefits so that people will be more incentivized to do so?
Well, certainly, I think accounting for the costs and benefits is important. At the moment, our development is entirely hinged on GDP. That's the metric that we use, and we need to go beyond GDP to measure our progress. And I think once we start to go beyond GDP and measure the progress in terms of healthier lives, in terms of intact ecosystems, in terms of the sustainable development goals, then we will be doing, we will be making policies based on the full picture, based on the full accounting.
Absolutely. Mr. Broekhoven, nature reserves perform multiple roles, such as helping to conserve particular species and biodiversity, as well as the conservation of ecosystems. We talked about the monetary aspect of it. Once we have that money ready to be pumped in, how can we get the most out of these protected areas?
Maybe just also to by complementing what Dr. Zahedi has said, I completely agree with his analysis, but also there's the element of reducing and stopping the investment in things that are bad for nature. So it's not only looking at how you finance and the cost-benefit analysis, but actually the order of magnitude of investments in incentives and subsidies and other investments that harm nature. If you can reduce those, then obviously the need to invest in conserving nature will also increase. Now, I think the other element there is on protected areas. Yes, you need to establish protected areas, but the other incredibly important aspect there is how you manage those protected areas so that they don't become so-called paper parks. So they exist on paper only, but they're not managed for the benefit of the services that they provide and the goods that they provide to people. And the other element is that, of course, many indigenous peoples and local communities, they have been managing biodiversity-rich areas for a very long time, and sort of recognizing and securing the rights of those people to continue to manage those areas will also contribute tremendously to that sort of area that's been conserved for the generation of benefits and goods.
Mr. Broekhoven, let me just press you on one thing you just said. Successful protected areas. Do you have examples maybe of successful protected areas in particular regions? And is that due to better government planning and policies, sustainable policies, lasting policies, or particularly high awareness locally? Or what are some of the reasons that can be attributed to the successful running of protected areas?
Yeah, I think there's many examples around the world where protected areas are successful. I think a few key elements in the success is that there is a consultative process put in place where all the people that have an interest in that protected area are involved in agreeing on how you manage that area, and then provide sufficient support and resources to implement these management activities. So it is really sort of a collective action that needs to take place.
Mr. Ndemba, there is a general consensus globally, of course, on the need to minimize biodiversity loss, but how can this be achieved in the developing world, where many might argue that a more important target really is meeting people's basic needs, material needs, and facilitating their basic rights, and biodiversity concerns may be secondary for now? What is your take on that?
Thank you so much. Whilst you may be right on the global consensus, on the need to meet, human basic needs. But as I indicated earlier on, the presence of human beings on planet Earth and the existence of biodiversity, these are two sides, or these we can call a double-sided sword, and one side cannot exist alone. So when it comes now to human basic needs, we also have to remember and be reminded that there is the right, which is basically from the human side, but there is also the other side, of the responsibility, which basically means that human beings also have a responsibility to take care of biodiversity if they are going to continue to enjoy the benefits. And this is where the equation is actually being missed. We tend to focus now more on our right to enjoy ourselves, but also ignoring the other side of biodiversity. But if you take away biodiversity, there will be no human life on this planet. So we have a responsibility, and this cannot exist in isolation of one another.
It's a very straightforward principle, isn't it? But unfortunately, people sometimes only see one edge of that sword, and they don't have the full picture. Where you are now, do you feel that people are educated about responsibility that you just mentioned, that people are brought to understand the severity of the issue, and that one cannot be had without the other?
Yes, I think in my context is, and in the region that I am, you find that the economic development, how it has actually ignored the long-standing cultures of maintaining and sustaining biodiversity, or the coexistence of communities and biodiversity, has been largely ignored because of the drive that there is the right for economic development, so that people can actually enjoy a better life, but at the expense of biodiversity. So the impacts that are beginning to emerge, if you look into continents like Africa, we are now seeing a greater reminder of how that right may have been abused at the expense of biodiversity. So many communities are now beginning to take initiative of saying, how can we regenerate biodiversity? How can we make some efforts in terms of restoration of what we actually destroyed?
Dr. Wan, coming to you now, your institute published a report on nature-based solution last October in COP15 of the UN Convention on Biodiversity, and you are one of the leading authors. Talk to us about nature-based solutions. How creative is that, and how pragmatic is that in solving the issues?
So nature-based solution, NBS, this term itself has been developed for more than 10 years. Well, China was invited by UN to co-lead this action track together with New Zealand in 2019. At that moment, I was in New York to witness this announcement. Now, more and more debates and dialogues around this topic. My institute, ICCSD, conducted the research focused on the synergy between biodiversity protection and climate change. From this perspective, this synergetic perspective, we think NBS has a huge potential, because the key challenge of us as human beings is that we ignore the nature mother's power for such a long time. And NBS can help us to rethink of the connection between human and nature. And this is also the core spirit of ecological civilization, which is in line with the SDGs. So from this perspective, I totally agree that nature-based solution is a creative solutions for UN's SDGs, in particular for biodiversity protection.
All right, everyone, thank you so much for your answers so far. I want to take you right to the next topic about climate change actions. But before that, let's take a look at the numbers and data we have gathered for this topic of climate change actions. Take a look. Climate change is causing extreme weather, intense heat waves, heavy rainfall, and higher coastal flooding. A global temperature rise of just 1.5 degrees Celsius would likely mean stronger storms and melting ice in places like the Arctic, one of the worst hit areas. The Arctic Ocean's ice cover reached a record minimum, and changes in ice thickness, snow cover, and melting permafrost are contributing to a global rise in sea levels. And since 1880, global mean sea level has risen about 8 to 9 inches, or 21 to 24 centimeters. And research shows that sea level rise is accelerating, and by 2050, projected to rise by more than 30 centimeters. Residents of cities and coastal areas face higher risks of flooding, shoreline erosion, waterborne diseases, and larger storms. And it's already happening and compelling people to leave their homes. According to the World Bank, the climate crisis could drive 216 million people to migrate within their own countries by 2050, with internal migration hotspots emerging as soon as 8 years from now. Scientists have found that greenhouse gases are a major contributor to global warming, and excess of carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide emissions alter the planet's natural greenhouse effect. Much of that excess comes from burning fossil fuels, unsustainable agricultural practices, and deforestation. Reducing greenhouse gases is possible, but requires major social, economic, and technological changes. Let us turn back to our panelists here. Mr. Broekhoven, climate change, we can see it out the window. It's no longer just an abstract concept. We're talking about wildfires, floods, droughts, and hurricanes, extreme weather events around the world that have greatly affected our lives as well as the lives of other species. How urgent is the problem?
Well, I think the science is very clear. This is a crisis, like there is a crisis with nature and biodiversity. And according to the latest scientific report that was published very recently, we only have a very short window of a small number of years to act adequately to remain within that 1.5 to 2 degrees climate change in the next few decades. So it is really a very urgent issue that needs our focused attention.
What is your analysis of the progress we've been making so far in meeting that objective? I mean, the window is really small. A lot of us have committed to meeting that target, but the progress report that we have so far isn't very optimistic, is it?
No, I agree with you. I mean, the transition, the energy transition is being put in place, but the pace is far too slow, and we really need to make a step change to achieve the goals that we have collectively agreed that we would be working towards.
All right, Mr. Zahedi, let me turn to you. According to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the most developed countries are the ones responsible for most of the emissions. How do you see this inequity, and how do we address that?
Yeah, of course, you're right. I mean, small island developing states, for example, contribute way less than 1% of global greenhouse gas emissions, but they are suffering huge impacts on a daily, weekly, monthly basis. There is certainly some inequality that we see there. But the reality is that our region of Asia Pacific now contributes over 50% of global greenhouse gas emissions. The reality is 5 of the top 10 countries with the greatest historic responsibility for GHG emissions are in our region of Asia. At the same time, the region hosts some of the most vulnerable countries and communities, from the low-lying atolls, the Kiribati, Maldives, that are literally facing an existential threat, to the low-lying coastal countries, Myanmar, Philippines, and all the others that, as you say, you see on the news almost every day. And in spite of how and who and which country generated historic emissions, the reality is the only way to protect the most vulnerable countries and the most vulnerable communities is to get the world on track for at most a 1.5 degree increase in temperature. And to do that, we need all countries, we need all major economies, we need all major emitters, including from the region of Asia to participate and to begin that decarbonization journey that takes us and our economies to essentially to a zero emission scenario by around the middle of this century.
Mr. Zahedi, where are we on that delegation, on that distribution of responsibilities when it comes to who shoulders more? Because people argue those who have emitted more obviously should have taken up more responsibility, and that has been a controversy issue with rich countries committing more, poorer countries committing less. Where are we on that delegation path?
Well, I'll tell you where we are in general. So where we are is that the nationally determined contributions or the commitments that countries are willing to make in terms of reduction of emissions are nowhere near what the science tells us is necessary. Here in Asia Pacific, our analysis shows that there's going to be an increase of emissions by about 35% by 2030, whereas we should actually be reducing our emissions by about 45%. But we can't make that needed reduction of 45% without involving all economies, all major economies and all major emitters. At the same time, there's got to be some sort of equity in the equation. And that's why it's so important, for example, to ensure the adequate financing is provided, especially to the most vulnerable, especially to those least able to finance this critical energy transition, starting with the 100 billion a year that is needed for under the Paris Climate Agreement and the Glasgow Act.
Mr. Ndaba, if what Mr. Zahedi said just now is any indication of what is generally needed around the world, all stakeholders must pitch in to help with this process. I mean, African nations have contributed a tiny proportion of greenhouse gases, but in terms of contributions, in terms of what Africa can contribute, are there some climate solutions the continent might be in a position to offer?
No, thank you so much. I do agree, I think, with the previous panelists that we are on one planet, one earth, and we are all affected in different ways. And even from Africa's position, we cannot be left behind, despite the fact that we are said to contribute to a tiny proportion of our greenhouse gas emissions. But the impact is quite severe. Even as I speak on this panel today, we have got our neighbors in the region that are located, which is South Africa, quite a big economy, but we just had over 400 people who have just died due to heavy rains that have flooded the eastern part of the country. We also have similar islands like Madagascar, where we have the northern part floods, the southern part is in drought, and we are also seeing a new emerging phenomena of cyclones that are now affecting and penetrating the southern African region. So with that, we are all affected, and with that recognition, we have to actually take action. So we have seen quite a number of countries that are now taking initiatives that includes, forest regeneration to help in carbon sinking, and also afforestation, particularly those businesses that are involved maybe in agriculture and tobacco production. There's also the concerted effort of adopting clean energy, such as solar systems, buying also and replacing all the equipment that is high emitting. But most of it on the business sector is really about realigning the business models in Africa such that they become climate responsive, and they push for measuring of emissions and taking actions to reduce the impacts from emissions.
Dr. Wang, we've heard about how Africa wants to contribute. What about China? China officially announced to achieve its carbon peak by 2030 and neutrality by 2060. Really ambitious goals if you consider that time frame of just 3 decades to go from peaking to neutrality. Help us understand how we are doing so far with that objective.
Yes, thank you. Before I talk about China, I have to say that carbon neutrality is the common future all human choose. So in fact, we are in front of the door of the green revolution in the history of human beings. And we have no other choices except the net zero future. China realized this historic moment and has announced its goals, as you mentioned. Domestically, China has released the implementation plans for carbon peak in key areas and sectors, as well as a series of supporting measures, and will put in place a 1+N policy framework for carbon peak and carbon neutrality. And here means different kind of industries. So the governments at a different level in China now are co-working on the implementation. So we can see that China government takes this promise very seriously.
All right, again, thank you so much for all of your expertise and insight. Coming up next is our topic. Besides global climate challenges, the COVID-19 outbreak worldwide has also greatly affected everyone's life and the environment we live in. Research shows the pandemic and the way we've responded to it has had both positive and negative impacts on Earth. Due to travel restrictions and social distancing rules, more people are working remotely, reducing travel and exercising at home. Studies show that these changes have significantly improved air quality, decreased greenhouse gas emissions, lessened water pollution and noise. It's also reduced pressure on tourist destinations, helping to restore ecological systems. But to control the virus, millions of tons of medical waste was generated globally in the form of gloves, face masks, and other items. According to the WHO, more than 140 million test kits have been shipped, which are expected to generate more than 2,600 tons of plastic waste and over 700,000 liters of chemical waste. Meanwhile, over 8 billion doses of vaccines have been administered globally, producing 144,000 tons of additional waste in the form of needles and safety boxes. And this plastic waste pollutes the environment. Some face masks have been discarded to natural habitats and eaten by animals, resulting in thousands of deaths. Mr. Broekhoven, let me pick up with you. The pandemic really has changed many aspects of our lives and society in general. In this context, there are two main types of thoughts. One is that with the pandemic, everything else, including climate change objectives, including sustainability goals, take a back row seat here. Another thought goes that this is actually an opportunity to encourage people to think more about what we need to do to protect our planet. Share with us what you think of the opportunities or challenges brought by the pandemic.
Thank you. I think the pandemic has generated a number of lessons that are relevant to this conversation. The first one is that prevention of pandemics and the spillover of diseases from wild animals to people is incredibly important. So we should not only be better prepared to deal with pandemics, but we really have to prevent them from taking place. And actually investing in preventing pandemics is much cheaper than investing in addressing the impacts of pandemics. So that is one really important lesson, that investing in nature conservation is an important aspect of pandemic management. The second one is what we've seen in that past few years is that governments and societies can make some really big shifts in approaches in a very short period of time, and they can back it up with a reallocation of significant amounts of money. Now that of course is relevant in the context of the discussion we just had in terms of financing for biodiversity and allocating funding to the biodiversity crisis. I think the other lesson that we've learned is that in many situations people were not able to socialize anymore. They were able to go out, and many people have rediscovered nature as a source of well-being by going out into nature, by walking around around the cities and national parks, etc. And maybe the final lesson is that we really need to sort out the equitable distribution of the benefits of the use of genetic resources. And the discussion about vaccine inequality has really brought that to the fore. In case of genetic resources, many of those can be found in countries with high levels of biodiversity, whereas the benefits in terms of pharmaceutical products and so on are generated in other countries. Now, how can you distribute those benefits better is an important factor in addressing the biodiversity crisis.
And Mr. Zahedi, the challenges posed by the pandemic and climate change are, of course, different in nature. Just now, Mr. Broekhoven gave us some of the lessons he thought people might gain from experiencing this pandemic, but there are also similarities between the pandemic and the topic we're discussing today. For example, both have local, national, and global implications, which require local, national, and global solutions. How do you reflect on the relations maybe between the pandemic and climate change?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. There are some parallels there. I mean, let me start by going back to what you were saying in terms of whether the pandemic has created a new opportunity for a different kind of development, for really pushing through that door that Dr. Wang was telling us about, the new future opportunities of the green economy. And so far, it's been a missed opportunity. We have to be honest. The investments have flown into the old brown economy that brings very little return and undermines further our environment. So how do we turn it around, or what are the lessons? I think the first one is definitely what Guido has talked about. I think the pandemic and climate change are both reminders that we must prepare ourselves for the unexpected. There will be more extreme weather, and there will be future shocks similar to the pandemic. So prevention is going to be vital. Setting up the right kinds of early warning systems, for example, is absolutely critical. I think the second thing that both climate change and the pandemic have revealed is the widespread inequality in our region of Asia Pacific. And this inequality manifests itself in vulnerability, so that any shock that comes along, whether it's climate related or pandemic related, pushes people back into poverty. In our region, the pandemic alone has probably pushed around 85 million people back into poverty. And what we've seen from the pandemic is the best response, or one of the best responses, one of the best investments to get ourselves ready for this scenario is social protection. And as a region, we are horribly underinvesting in social protection, way below the global average and way below the OECD average. So that's a second lesson we take away, is the importance of social protection and indeed universal healthcare. And maybe the third one is the lesson of interdependence. We had forgotten how dependent we are on each other as countries. When the connectivity broke, then when trade slowed down, we saw the implications, certainly in terms of vaccine distribution, but beyond that, for food, medicine, and much more. And we need to, I think, rethink multilateralism and reinvest in connectivity, people to people, but country to country connectivity. It's an absolute lifeblood when we're confronted with scenarios that bring about increased vulnerability, increased pandemics, and increased climate change.
These are all very valuable lessons, a lot of the times acquired the hard way. We can only hope that people can remember these lessons with longer-term thinking, longer-term planning, so that they can continue to guide us in post-pandemic days. Mr. Ndaba, I want to come to you now. The international effort to halt the pandemic was really unprecedented. Governments across the world were forced into actions they probably never imagined to really put an end to an extremely concerning global problem. Of course, this is a problem of an urgent medical emergency. But do you hope that there could be similarly more concerted efforts when it comes to addressing our climate change goals?
Well, thank you. I think looking at the pandemics, even the scale in which even the current COVID-19 pandemic impacted, businesses, supply chains, including investors, their pockets also, being tapped into. So this actually brought in quite a lot of, pressure even on governments to act. But if you allow me to take a step back, one of the key things that I had to actually pick up was that we were actually quick to forget lessons of recent pandemics. For example, we had the Ebola outbreak in Africa, which killed quite many people in Central and West Africa at a large scale, including even those who did come to help from developed countries. Some of them lost their life. But we were quick actually to forget about this. And we thought this was just the end. It's one of those incidences. But now with this current pandemic, I think the lessons were quite deeper, and the impact also affected our investors, the business, who actually started seeing their pockets being emptied, due to the pandemic. But I believe that if this is the same with climate change, there will be exerted pressure on governments to actually act. But key to it is, we now need to start rethinking our business and economic models such that being prepared for uncertainties becomes part and parcel of our business and economic models in the way that we operate, because even climate is affecting different jurisdictions in different ways. But we still continue with the same investment and business practices, which we now need to take a very serious look.
And Dr. Wang, coming to you now. In that video we just showed to our viewers at the top of this segment, we saw efforts to curb the spread of COVID-19, such as lockdown, social distancing, and closures, are reported to have caused a drop in emissions of the kinds of greenhouse gases that have been destroying our atmosphere. But unfortunately, this is a very reversible trend, a very reversible momentum. We've talked about how people tend to easily forget about hard lessons. Where do you see this trend go next as countries ease restrictions, as we head to the next stage fighting this pandemic?
Okay, I think we can focus on a science-based or data-based analysis. So the global carbon emissions reached its highest level in 2019, which is 367 billion tons. After the outbreak of COVID-19, the carbon emission dropped by around 5%. But according to the new report of IPCC AR6, the trend is up again. So here we should think of the relationship between development, economic development, and emission reduction seriously, as the guest mentioned just now. So emission reduction is not to reduce productivities, but to take the path of ecological priority, green and low carbon development, and promote a green transition in economic development, and achieve greater development in the next round of human revolution, the green revolution. So only all multi-stakeholder realize this logic line behind the scene, then we can reduce the emission, and we can reduce the poverty, protect the biodiversity, the nature, and recover from the pandemic sustainably. As Mr. Zahedi mentioned, we cannot reach the SDGs by only reaching one of them. We should walk out from each silo and choose a systematic ways of thinking to explore the solutions.
I mean, a lot of the times it's not just about what we wish to do, what we should do, but also about what we are capable of doing. Dr. Wang, I do want to stay with you on this for a little bit longer. In this post-pandemic era where economic recoveries are pretty weak across the world and where we see regional conflicts are driving up commodity prices, energy price, and inflation in multiple regions of the world, where do we find the incentives, the money, the economic power to continue what we wanted to do in terms of curbing emissions, in terms of fighting climate change, in terms of supporting the Paris Climate Accord, going from this point?
I think as we observed, we all find that so many, complicated problems around of Earth, and as a human, we have to, earn money to keep our, life ahead. But the key point is that we can integrate the climate-friendly perspective into the recovery process, and that's maybe ways of thinking to help us to find the right solution. For example, to recover from pandemic, we should keep our work and mission sustainably. So we have to continue the dialogues, the meetings, and our daily work. So we are used to online meetings, home office, and gradually we realize that, we don't need too many business trips. Well, this kind of online working style can reduce the transportation emissions. Well, we can see that pandemic changed our ways of thinking to some extent, and some of them are not positive, but some of them are very useful. So this kind of useful change is a kind of gift with wisdom from the nature. And this is also, I think, why it's so important we have the program in this special day, in Earth Day, and we should call on more people to think of this kind of a positive change and encourage all of us to just hold on and keep our inner peace, and then find our, useful solutions towards the common future.
Right, Mr. Zahedi, the integration Dr. Wang talked about just now, I love the sound of that. Does it concern you that facing the economic status that we see around the world today, that governments could lose the vision, the political will, the policy they had in place, just because all of this now has to take a back seat compared to, pre-pandemic days?
To be honest, I'm not sure that governments can afford to do that, because as the fiscal space shrinks, as the expenditures have gone out on dealing with the pandemic, what governments can possibly continue investing in fossil fuel subsidies? It's madness, right? That money is much better invested in a different green future, in one that generates green jobs, in one that generates green and clean energy. So I think it's actually the opportunity is here for spending smart. And it's not just for the environment. And what we've learned from the previous financial crisis is if governments just react to a crisis by retrenching, the result ultimately is increased inequality and an undermining of development. So spending smart, spending in social protection, spending on universal healthcare, spending on education, spending on ICT connectivity to enable us to do what we're doing today, and investing in the biodiversity and the ecosystems that are the foundation of so much of our economies is quite simply spending right and spending smart. Any other way is locking countries and economies into really a losing strategy with stranded investments, with products that use too many resources to be produced, and ultimately possibly even facing tariffs and trade barriers as other parts of the world erect their sort of their carbon taxes and so on. So really, it is about spending our way out of this pandemic, but doing it in a smart way.
Mr. Ndama, can I get your take on this topic also? Because my takeaway from what Dr. Wan said, what Mr. Zahedi said, is that it doesn't have to be one way or the other. You don't have to be carefully striking that balance now. Dr. Wan used the word integration. Mr. Zahedi said, spend your money smart, invest smart, continue to go with green. What is your take on this issue?
No, thank you so much, for the important point Dr. Zahad raised. I think the green transition, which is I think the only option that we have at the moment, it doesn't have to be theoretical, because it's the actions that are going to provide the evidence in terms of the impact and of how green transitions are going to actually, create the results or mitigate the impacts that we are currently faced with. And I think from my end, one of the key things that has been a point of worry, from this is how prepared, for example, developing countries, are in terms of post-pandemic conflicts, as many countries struggle for survival due to high unemployment, caused by the pandemic, or responding to environmental, issues. But all in all, the pandemic taught us great lessons and even great reminders of things that we were actually aware of, but ignoring. So really the lessons that we should be spending our money wisely in a sustainable manner and focusing on key priorities that actually sustains our life in the long term, whilst minimizing, the negative impacts on nature, are very, very critical. And we have always known this. And this is just a reminder coming to us.
All right, and Mr. Broekhoven, can I ask you to pitch in on this also? I mean, we are moving, closely to a very post-pandemic era, and the momentum we had going towards a greener future doesn't have to be interrupted. But what we're doing, coping with the pandemic and coping with economic recovery in the post-pandemic days. What is your take on the balance or the lack of between economic recovery and our climate goals, our sustainability goals?
Yeah, there's many things that need to be done, but one thing that is certainly really important here is political leadership and political will, and also to acknowledge that some of these transitions that we're talking about towards a green economy, towards a carbon neutral economy, they need to be just and fair, because there's vested interest need to be addressed, but also we need to make sure that the most vulnerable are not being affected in a negative way by these transitions. So they need to be facilitated. And also I think in terms of sort of nature biodiversity, there's one thing that we collectively need to do, and that is to agree where we want to go. For climate, we have the net zero carbon global goal. We've got the 1.5 degree. Everybody knows that. For nature, we don't have a global goal. And what we are suggesting is that we do need to agree on a global goal to halt and reverse biodiversity loss by 2030 to be nature positive. And there's actually a great opportunity later this year in Kunming in China, when hopefully a new global agreement for biodiversity conservation will be concluded, for leaders to agree on that common goal, that guiding light for nature that is equal to sort of the guiding global goal for climate.
All right, everyone, I want to take you straight to our last segment of the day, talking about sustainable future. And really, it's everyone's job to save our planet. For our last topic of the day, we're going to discuss how every nation, organization, and individual could demonstrate their support for environmental protection. And prior to the forum, we have collected some questions from netizens on CGTN social media platforms. And we have chosen some questions for our guests to answer. Let's put these questions up for our viewers to see here. The first one, I'm going to put this to Mr. Zahedi. To balance economic growth and environmental protection, we are encouraged to achieve sustainability in economic development. What are the challenges in achieving sustainability in economic development?
A big question to start off this last segment. You know, let me pick out of the many challenges that we have one, and I think that one is short-termism. We look for short-term returns in business. We look for policies with short-term returns that match the political cycles, and yet the investments that are needed are very much long-term. And that incongruity is sometimes as big a challenge as any, because as you said, and we're so grateful for this opportunity you've given us, the case has been made. We know it makes financial sense. We know that we cannot live without biodiversity, as we've been told on this panel. We know that we have to keep climate to 1.5 degrees, above which really the impacts are going to be very harmful for the most vulnerable countries and the most vulnerable communities. The scientific case has been made. We know that economically, often it's cheaper to invest in renewables than it is in fossil fuels. So the economic case has also been made, but sometimes that short-termism, sometimes those political interests that Guido also referred to, become a bit of a barrier. And the more we do what we're doing today and put the facts on the table, put the science on the table, put the economics on the table, I hope the more we can overcome that.
All right, and let's move on to the second question we have here. How can our leaders speed up the fulfillment of their climate promises? Mr. Zahedi talked about letting go of that short-termism, of course, and Mr. Broekhoven said political leadership, political will is of critical essence here. Mr. Ndeba, can I put this question to you? How can our leaders speed up the fulfillment of their climate promises?
Thank you so much. I think from my end, the world and all leaders need to change how we measure economic performance. I think as long as we remain stuck on measuring our economic performance based on GDP, we'll still continue to have these challenges. But my call is that leaders need to start looking into moving to sustainable GDP or green GDP that also incorporate issues of nature, climate change in how we measure economic performance. So key to that is the need to ensure that climate change, biodiversity, and environmental protection are all included in national policies, trade agreements, and investment policies. Such that as we do our business, these becomes conditions in terms of how our economic activities will continue. But the key to it as well is our international financial institutions who play a critical role in terms of providing financial capital. So in their lending practices or financing arrangements, these issues also need to be included. But lastly, one of the critical impact driver that we have not talked quite a lot are the small businesses, those that are emerging, that are anchoring many economies. How are we also taking them on board as we look at our response to environmental protection, climate change, biodiversity issues? And finally, tax incentives actually play a very big catalytic role in driving action. Where there's evidence that has been provided in terms of actions by businesses and our leaders. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. Another question is about awareness. I want to put this one to Mr. Broekhoven. What can we do to promote environmental awareness, especially among the youth? I think awareness level is pretty high these days. It's actually, more on the pragmatic side, actions on the ground that sometimes people are less aware of or are less willing to contribute to. Your thoughts on this, Mr. Broekhoven?
Yes, indeed, awareness is increasing. We actually commissioned research recently, and we showed that 65% of increase in Twitter activity on nature conservation over the past 5 years, continuing throughout the pandemic. Also actions like around this Earth Day, which sees an ever-growing engagement of citizens. Youth for Climate type actions are giving us hope. I think the real issue is to galvanize and translate this interest and momentum amongst citizens into real action. And I think there it depends where you sit and who you are and what your role in society is, and what type of action you can take. But I think a really important action is to put pressure on politicians and on the private sector to facilitate that change. I mean, here where I live, it's still more expensive to buy biodiversity-friendly products and bio products than it is normal products. Well, then citizens really can't be asked to act on their own. It needs to be part of a larger framework of actions that will be put in place by governments and that also facilitates these transitions by the private sector.
Just to press you on that, in terms of school education, do you think our schools, our educational institutions are doing enough? Because we're talking about what we've realized very shortly and very recently in meeting the Paris Climate Accord, in meeting the rise of the temperature within 1.5 degrees, and how we are lacking in terms of progress, how the pace has been too slow. Do you think that has to be communicated in a better way?
No, absolutely. I think communication, awareness raising and capacity building are incredibly important, also to dispel some of the myth of the potential implications that the implementation of the Paris Agreement may have on our lives, on the quality of our lives, and on our well-being, and of course to articulate also what we can do to implement the agreement. Absolutely.
All right, thank you. And Dr. Wang, I'll be coming to you next to answer this question. What is the best advice for sustainable living as an individual? You remote working. I think a lot of people would feel good about that. It's their employers that might have a problem, wanting to get them in office. Your take on this, Dr.
Yeah. I can tell you a story. I once talked with my mother, and she heard that my work is related to climate change, and she thought, wow, climate change, what's that? It's a big word, how to understand it, and she asked how I can address climate change at a personal level. And I told her, yeah, it's very easy. Lower the air conditioner, just take the bus and save the water, And she said, I don't need you to tell me to do such kind of things because it's a traditional Chinese culture, told me. So, but I feel a bit frustrated because I think this is a common solutions around the world that we can protect the earth and we can address the climate change. Yes, we need some creative, innovative solutions, but now we are still on the road. But what I want to say is that we have only one Earth Mother, and we need to do everything we can to protect our Earth, to respect the nature. So although those actions are old sins, but if these are what we can do at this stage, why not? So this is my suggestion to how to live in a sustainable way. Just do everything everything what you think can help to protect our common earth.
Dr. Wang, I'm just curious because I believe not just your mother wants to pick your brain on what they're capable of doing in terms of helping the climate change cause. You get this all the time. Your friends, your students come up to you for tips that they can do, they can implement on a daily basis. You can't just tell them all to just follow good Chinese virtues and live a frugal life. What is it that they can do pragmatically on an everyday basis, Dr. Wang?
I think from the discussion today, one conclusion is that we should, work out from the silo as we discussed. So not only focus on one of the SDGs, but try to find the synergetic solutions, use the different, education background. So I think if all the people think of in this kind of a systematic way, then we can work together. Multi-stakeholder can come together, not only the government, but also the media, local NGOs, international organizations, and the general public. We can co-work some new solutions for the net zero future.
All right, I do believe we still have a little bit of time left. I want to go last round with everybody here. Talk to us about what you do in your daily life as a small contribution to the climate change cause. Can I begin with Mr. Indaba first?
I think from my end, the way I work on a day-to-day basis to support businesses in how they can contribute to climate change, how they can run their businesses in a sustainable manner. And this is what we have been doing. And we also provide technical support in terms of the application of international standards on corporate sustainability in terms of how they can embed them in their business model so that their economic activities minimize harm on environment and also ensuring that they protect societal harmony in the way they actually operate. So that's my day-to-day work.
All right, thank you so much. Appreciate that. And Mr. Zahedi, I do want our viewers to go away from our live streaming today with something that they feel they can do, with something that they didn't probably know before. What would be your advice?
I can tell you what we did here at the UN, right? We have a big compound with thousands of workers. We banned the use of single-use plastics. We offset entirely all our energy use, including our travel, and we've reduced our use of water and increased the recycled waste, and in fact reduced our waste footprint entirely. It's a small contribution, but if everybody tried to contribute in a way, it would make a big difference. It won't make all the difference though, right? We still need governments and corporates to come in with major shifts in behavior and investment. But I think there are these simple steps that all of us can certainly take.
That's how big differences begin, with the simple, doable differences that everyone is capable of. Thank you so much. Mr. Broekhoven, your turn now.
Yeah, thanks. In the office, we have established on the office solar panels. We've also looked at our pension scheme to make sure that it invests in sustainable activities and not in things that harm nature. Also, for our office, we have a compensation scheme for the costs of traveling by public transport to the office to commute. And at a very personal level, after a day in the office, and particularly Zoom calls, I really like to be outside. So I'm helping to manage a little nature reserve near the town where I live.
All right, thank you so much. I believe that is all the time we have for today. Really valuable insights from all of our guests. I do want to take this opportunity to thank you all for talking to us, for sharing with us your experiences, and of course, for highlighting this day. And in honoring the spirit of the Earth Day, let's all strive to act in a bold way, to innovate in a broad way, and implement in an equitable way. Thank you so much to all of my guests, to all the viewers who tuned in to our special live streaming today. I am Zhongshi in Beijing, and bye for now.